Hey everybody, part 2 of the meta timeline where we talk about the second update that Supercell has released for the game. The meta timeline is a series that Rumham and I are doing to kind of log the changes that Clash Royale has gone through over time. In our previous video, we talked about the launch of the game and how the first patch was for the game. In this video, we're going to talk about how Supercell started transforming, and you had mentioned in the previous video that Supercell had a very knee-jerk reaction in their first balance update. I think things were beginning to slowly change since the second update. I wasn't playing around this time, Rumham. What can you tell me about how this February patch affected the game and how it changed things?
Yeah, this was awesome. This was the first patch after the game had been out for around a month that people started to figure out what the game was kind of like and some of the problems with it, and this patch tried to address it. This was actually one of the biggest updates in the game's history, February 2nd, well, a month before global launch. It was one of the biggest patches. We've broken it up into 2 videos. This video is going to talk about just the game update, the changes that were made to the game system, and the next video is going to be the balance changes. So go ahead and subscribe. I'm really excited for this series. We're going to cover everything from the game launch all the way up to modern times, and we hope that this can be a really solid record of what the game was as the meta changes over months and years. And Rainy, the game was really weird back then. It's funny, the game was so fun to play. Like, if you just play like individual games of Clash Royale, it's so fun. But looking back, the meta was actually in a really bad place before the February 2nd update. There was a lot of defensive towers that were really strong. Almost every defensive tower in the game had a 60-second lifespan, whereas most of them now, at the time we're recording this video, are at 30 or 40 seconds. But at the time, almost all of them had 60 seconds. The most egregious of this was Inferno Tower. Imagine how good Inferno Tower is now at stopping big pushes, and imagine it when it lasted forever. So there was definitely a time where at this point in the meta, normal beatdown strategies didn't work. Giant wasn't very popular. Even cards like P.E.K.K.A. and maybe Golem was like the only one that was even loosely popular. But for the most part, you weren't playing like giant decks and just regular beatdown decks because you could never get through things like Inferno Tower. So instead, what you would see is a lot of siege strategies, a lot of X-Bow. Mortar wasn't actually good. Mortar kind of cost like 6 elixir and wasn't very strong right now. But like X-Bow was very popular. Rocket cycling and fireballing towers was really popular because it was a way to get guaranteed damage through instead of just dying to an Inferno Tower. And if you were playing any sort of like beatdown strategy, you played freeze. 100% of people who were like going to come across played freeze because it lasted for a really long time. It was one of the only things you could do to just turn off all the defensive buildings.
So obviously the game is very different than how we understand it would be in the next few months, and even a while after that there were a lot of changes. But even beyond these specific game kind of meta interactions, the game was very different just on a very basic level. Only on this February patch did we get the introduction of the legendary arena, which that means prior to this there was no legendary arena.
Yeah, that's right. Like when we actually go through these notes here, some of the craziest things were things that you think have always been in the game didn't actually exist for the first month or so of the game's lifespan. Legendary arena was the first new arena to be added at 3,000 trophies. At this point in time, the highest arena in the game was 1,700 trophies, and it was Royale Arena. Builder's Arena didn't exist yet, and neither did Frozen Peak. So it went from 1,700 to 3,000 all of a sudden. So if you think the climb now from 23 to 3,000 was tough, imagine it being 600 trophies longer. One of the most popular decks to play at the time in the ladder was actually spawner decks. Spawner decks were like super popular because Witch was pretty good, Goblin Hut was pretty good, and Barbarian Hut was pretty good because you couldn't just attack normally into things like Inferno Tower. So instead you'd be like, all right, I'm not going to play Barbarians because I'm going to die. I'll play Barbarian Hut and things like that. And you'll see a lot of spawner decks being pretty popular at the time. But Legendary Arena was the first time that I think people had this big goal to shoot for. And of course, it was the first time they introduced Season Reset and then Legend Trophies. At the time we're recording this video, Legend Trophies still don't really do anything, but they've said that they're going to use them in the future. So it's crazy that people have been saving up Legendary Trophies since February.
Yeah,
really.
Yeah, absolutely insane to think about. So Legendary Arena got introduced, and the second thing that maybe is the most relevant to the SuperMagicalCup is the tournament rules are finally established. And this was a great kind of sigh of relief for a lot of players, just because they wanted the ability to compete. They wanted the ability to kind of play Clash Royale and find out who the best players were, and really outside of the ladder environment. Because don't get me wrong, I think ladder is another area of the game that is a different kind of rule set that you have to master and a different style that you have to play. very valuable, but then competitive and tournament rule set is something else entirely. And I think them releasing these tournament rules really set a great idea for Clash Royale as an attraction for competitive players to come and try their skills out.
Yeah, the interesting thing about tournament rules early on is that, well, prior to this, the first month of the game, friendly battles were just like anything, right? Like anyone you played, you had whatever cards. But what's cool is their first attempt at tournament rules, they have level 3 epics, level 6 rares, and level 8 commons and players. No legendaries didn't exist at the time, so there was no like legendaries to counter with. But later on, they ended up raising the tournament rule cap because they felt it was a little too low and to account for legendaries that came in later. But this is the first time that people started having like a goal to shoot for and say that, okay, I know that when tournaments come out, my cards will be capped and it won't be like, have to be max level or whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. And
one change that I totally forgot about until we started this series and we're going over the patch is that it used to cost gold to play battles.
Yeah.
And when the game first came out, it cost gold to play battles. For the first month, it cost like, I want to say 5 gold or 4 gold. It wasn't much, but it was, when you're already starved for gold, spending 100 or 200 gold a day was kind of a bummer on matches. Yeah. And if you were out of gold, you couldn't play. So this was the first time that they removed gold costs, and then later on they would add a gold reward, but at least from February 2nd until then, it was free to play battles, but not necessarily profitable. And before that, it cost money.
It costs money. So a lot of kind of infrastructure changes to Clash Royale came during this February patch, and I would think a lot of them are kind of like a step in the right direction for the game. It really, I think, grew the popularity of the game and really included a lot more players, kind of made it a lot more friendly, both making it easier to play more games, giving an opportunity for people to play competitively, and then also giving ladder players a direction to head and more progression to conquer.
Yeah, and they had a bunch of balance changes, which again we're going to cover in our next video. So if you want to see just the balance changes, that is number 3 in the Meta Timeline series. The last thing I want to talk about from the game update that were actually a lot of fun. Well, the first was pretty easy. They added death damage. So when Balloon, Giant Skeleton, Golem, they all die, they explode and deal some damage. That was actually an unknown number until they started putting it in the cards with this update. This was actually pretty important because Giant Skeleton was actually one of the big cards in the meta. It was actually kind of like a catch-all defensive card. It was interesting that once they put that death damage in, you could be like, okay, that's how much damage it does. Because it just seems to blow up everything, and I don't know exactly how much it's doing.
Yeah.
The best change, and this isn't actually covered at all in the balance update, but this was the funniest, like to this day, the funniest thing in the Clash Royale meta, was early on in the game's lifespan, you could trap units with Tombstone. So what you could do is, you know how when you play a Hog Rider on the side and you play goblins next to it, something about how they resolve pushes the Hog Rider a little bit towards the wall, and then he ends up jumping over the wall and like avoiding the center towers. So in the similar situation, if you used to play Giant Skeleton, Witch, and a few other cards with a Tombstone at the same time, the Tombstone would push it back into the corner, and it would just be stuck there trying to walk with the Tombstone keeping it in place. Well, what this was used for was you would put a Witch back there, and it would make unlimited skeletons. So you just kept casting skeletons over and over and over again. And then what would happen is eventually, after the 60 seconds of the Tombstone, well, she's made a bunch of skeletons already, but then when it blows up, there's a whole bunch more skeletons and the Witch there. You've probably cycled back through your cards and through your elixir to be able to play a second Witch with the one who's now released. And you say like, oh, well, that seems dumb. That's 8 elixir. Why don't you just attack and get killed? Well, Inferno Tower lasted for 60 seconds and was unable to get beaten, right? So this was one of the things you could do back when defensive towers were really strong, and this bug allowed for that. This patch changed that, so you could no longer save up giant skeletons or save up witches for later, but it was a really fun thing to do in the first month of the game until they patched it.
Right. So they were making a lot of changes to the game itself, and then also the balance changes where I think in this kind of patch were much more directed and really looking to, Supercell was starting on their way of kind of promoting offense over defense.
Yes.
So
this was the patch that started offense over defense, was because early in the game's lifespan, defense was so popular. And as a final little fun note, the last thing we said in the first video was TV Royale got nerfed. It went from 2 replays an hour to 1 replay an hour. Well, don't worry, the buffs came back for TV Royale, because with this update, you actually got those push notifications. A new Clanmates battle was featured on TV Royale. The fun thing is, before those push notice, you didn't know. You'd have to watch TV Royale and see if you made it on, or sometimes I would log in and my clan would be like, whoa, you're on TV, go check it out. But now you get a little push notification and knew about it.
Cool. So in our next video, we'll be covering the nitty-gritty details of the unit changes and how this February patch really affected the meta and how it got to what it would be today and what it would be months after the changes. So
this was one of the most influential patches in the game, so you should definitely want to tune in for episode 3 to see all the different balance changes. And you'll be shocked at what some of these cards used to be like before the changes.
All right, so make sure you join Rumham and I in the next Meta Timeline video.